Welcome to Dreamland's Whitley Strieber. Later in the show, Linda Moulton Howe's got a hot update from Texas. The military is now backtracking and saying they did have jets in the air, and it was their jets that everyone saw. Not even the Dallas Morning News is buying that. The media and the American public are sick of the cover-up, and it's becoming very, very obvious that it's over. And did you see, by the way, that incredible image from Mars of the apparent figure that the scientists are saying is a trick of light? Well, I'm sorry. It's either a figure or a statue. Tricks of light don't have arms and dark images around the waist. I mean, how stupid do they think we are? How do you explain it, though? Well, that's another question. It might have something to do with today's guest, Joseph Farrell. We're going to be talking about cosmic war. Are we the remnant of a greater civilization? This is a question that is a burning question in my mind for a particular reason, and that is that many, many years ago, when I first was involved with the Mars Face, when I sat in an apartment in New York City in 1985, in October of 1985, with Dick Hoagland, looking over the old Viking photographs and looking at that face staring up from below, I joined a group of scientists who were then on a message system. This was pre-internet, that where we were discussing what had happened on Mars. And this was long before all of the lying and the confusion and the NASA nonsense, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the changes in the Martian surface that have come to obscure those forms that were so clear in the Viking photographs. Now, one of the things I will never forget is one of those messages came up and it said, Mars was murdered. And the message referred to the D&H pyramid and that crater in the lower edge of it, and said that this particular scientist said, who became quite a famous scientist, I won't mention his name because I think that he'd probably be ruined in the planetological community now if anyone knew that he had ever said this. In any case, he said that that pyramid that had been entered by something that had come from the side, not from above. In other words, it was not a crater, but something had penetrated it, blown up inside, and caused the entire pyramid to collapse. And understand that this thing is many, many times the size of the Giza pyramid, and so whatever it was happening on an absolutely gigantic scale. Joseph Farrell, I'm so excited to talk about the possibility of cosmic war in the distant past. His book, The Cosmic War, Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Physics, and Ancient Texts. Welcome, Joseph.
Well, thank you for having me back, Whitley. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, you've been with us any number of times, and for good reason. I don't think I know of anyone who knows more about things like the Nazi UFO connection and all kinds of really fascinating stuff. In fact, if you could talk about the Nazi UFO connection for a few minutes, I would be very glad.
Well, sure. One of the things that I've come across, and actually I have a new book at the publisher right now that kind of pursues the story a little bit further. The Bell Project, which many of your listeners will remember from previous shows, I believe, was in part a project to master the manipulation of scalar or torsion fields, whatever you wish to call them, and to do so in part for propulsion purposes, in part for the purposes of accessing what we would call free energy or zero-point energy.
Now, remind us about the Bell Project, but some of us may not remember.
Okay, the Bell was Nazi Germany's most highly classified research project during the Second World War. It was classified higher than their atomic bomb project, which I also believe was much more successful than we've been led to believe. They classified it as Kriegsentscheidend, which is a German word that means war decisive or decisive for the war. So in other words, this was at the very, very pinnacle of all of their tremendously exotic secret weapons projects. And the bell itself was this device that stood approximately 15 to 18 feet tall, about 12 to 15 feet wide. It looked like a bell, and hence that's how it got the nickname. But it was a project that was housed in Lower Silesia, which is that little finger of Germany that used to stick down between Poland and Czechoslovakia. It was housed underground. It was tested at extraordinarily high voltages with some rather exotic materials in it. And according to the concentration camp victims and so on who actually were forced to work in this project during the war, they saw this thing floating at nighttime, in some cases above the tree lines at night in glowing kind of a pale blue glow. So what I believe the bell to be is probably the actual historical basis for many of the Nazi UFO accounts and legends that we've been hearing since the end of the Second World War. Now, one more thing about it that I think is kind of fascinating that ties, interestingly enough, into Richard Hoagland's most recent book, Dark Mission, is that at the end of the Second World War, the Bell Project went completely missing, along with the SS general who had control of the project and all of its project documentation. And there really are only two tracks that can be ascertained from the historical record as to where it might have gone. One of them is that it disappeared into some independent post-war Nazi research project in Latin America. And the other, of course, would be that it entered the labyrinthine paperclip elements that we brought into this country after the war and disappeared into some very super secret American anti-gravity project. So it's a fascinating story, and the reason I mention Richard Hoagland is that, of course, in his new book, Dark Mission, he has come to the conclusion that not only was there a secret NASA space program, but that it probably had access to some of these technologies or similar technologies, and moreover, that these elements, consisting in part of Nazis and secret society connections and so on, had something to do with the Kennedy assassination, which is more or less the conclusion that I came to in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell. So it's a really fascinating topic, and it dovetails and spins out in any number of directions.
You know, when shortly after I published Communion, I received a letter from a woman who had been walking in the woods with her son. And she said that a little man in a blue uniform, a tiny figure, had come out of a cave in these woods and said to her that he was a rebel and that the people of Earth had lost a war many thousands of years ago, that this war had involved great destruction in our solar system, and that the war had been between Earth and Mars, and that Mars had lost its ability to support life, but the Martians had not lost the war, that they had, in fact, captured our souls, and they kept us in a state of perpetual reincarnation. And in their language, the word for our planet was dead forever. We would continue to reincarnate into the physical forever. And he said he felt this was wrong and that we should be released. How do you react to that?
Well, it's a very intriguing story, and in fact, the whole idea of a war between Earth and Mars is kind of the conclusion that I've come to in the Cosmic War. I posit in the book the existence of a civilization based on some of the texts that I examine, that this civilization was interplanetary in nature, that it consisted at the minimum of a civilization which existed here on Earth, on our local celestial neighbor, the Moon, most definitely on Mars, and probably had outposts or colonies, as it were, on some of the satellites of Jupiter and Saturn. So it was a rather extensive thing. And in saying that, I want to kind of reinforce your opening remarks about Mars and the D&M pyramid and Mars having been murdered, because in my own researches, this is what I've come across. Graham Hancock has said something very similar. Richard Hoagland, of course, in his book, The Monuments of Mars, talks very specifically about the damage to the D&M pyramid. And the scientist that he consulted said that the damage has every appearance of being similar to the type of deep scouring penetration that one would expect from a very, very high energy particle beam. Now, I find that extraordinarily intriguing, Whitley, especially in connection with this story about a war between Earth and Mars, because in my research in the Cosmic War, one of the things that I point out is that the modern plasma cosmology physics that has been developed as an offshoot of some of the thinking of Swedish physicist Hannes Alfvén, this physics looks at some of the planetary geological features, such as the Hyginus Rill on the Moon, and more importantly, the Valle Marineris on Mars, which is, as you know, this extraordinarily huge, almost Grand Canyon-like feature that literally stretches across the entire equator of one entire hemisphere of the planet.
Well, I believe it's actually bigger than the Grand Canyon.
Oh, yes, much, much bigger. I mean, I'm just trying to give the listeners a picture in their mind that they can compare this to, but it's much, much deeper by several miles and much wider by several tens, if not hundreds of miles in some places. But this literally stretches across, almost in a straight line, an entire hemisphere of the Martian surface. And one of the interesting things that one of these plasma physicists has pointed out is that this feature on Mars has every appearance of having been literally scoured out by a tremendously huge plasma electrostatic discharge. Now, I find it extraordinarily interesting because if we go back to ancient Egyptian, Hurrian, and Sumerian texts, they refer oftentimes to the scarred warrior. And, you know, Mars's association with war in the human culture and astrology and esoteric tradition dates back literally millennia. So I think what we're looking at here is precisely as you say. We're looking at a war that specifically evolved, Earth and Mars, and it resulted in the literal physical murder or destruction of that planet's environment. And I think, you know, the story that you mentioned also indicates a spiritual connection or problem with humanity that has stemmed from that time. And again, I don't have any argument with that idea, because this really is the only conclusion that I can come to after having examined some of the texts that I examined in the Cosmic War. There was a spiritual consequence to this war. I think it's been with us ever since.
A spiritual consequence in what sense?
Well, I think that in part, you know, if we look at some of the Sumerian texts, I think that it's certainly clear that there was some sort of alteration of humanity that took place by deliberate manipulation, almost at the outset of the creation of humanity.
Yeah, you make quite a case for this in the book. I thought it was brilliant, and it's disturbing, because what do you think they did to us?
Well, you know, Whitley, I honestly don't know. To speculate a bit about that question, because it's such an important one. I think in part it has to be that there was some sort of alteration to the human genome, because, you know, and I'm still researching this question. We have all of this junk DNA. And I've read a couple of papers in genetics where geneticists are rather mystified as to why the human organism seems to run down so quickly and die. It's almost as if certain things in the genome have been deliberately turned off. And that dovetails, that whole view actually dovetails, I think, with the whole Sumerian tradition, with the biblical tradition, and so on. That at some point in the primordial past, there was this physical and spiritual corruption of humanity. But it's interesting to me, in terms of this war context and the Sumerian texts themselves, I think increasingly that we have to consider seriously the possibility that somebody else, maybe our distant ancestors or galactic cousins, whatever one wishes to call them, I think that this was something deliberately done to us. And in terms of the war scenario, I think we have to speculate a bit further in terms of maybe this was some sort of punishment for our role in that war that wrought such destruction. It spins out in any number of fascinating ways, and I think we have to consider all these possibilities very carefully.
And I wonder, therefore, the next question in my mind is what caused the war? Exactly what was going on back then that it caused us and others to engage in such a titanic conflict?
Well, this is really the central question, and I get into it at great length in the Cosmic War.
Yes, I know. And I'm hoping you'll get into it at some length here.
Yeah. Well, I consult 3 different families of texts, and most of them are from the Middle East. I consult the Egyptian Edfu temple texts, some Hurrian texts, and of course the Sumerians. And what emerges from these texts is a very interesting thing, and again, I find the cultural parallels to modern times almost frightening because of the spiritual resemblance of things that we see going on in terms of motivations for this war. If we look at the Sumerian texts, one of the things that occurs almost immediately in terms of their own understanding of prehistory is the theft of some sort of technology that is described in the text as the tablets of destinies. Initially, the Sumerian goddess Tiamat steals these tablets of destinies from their rightful possessor, and she immediately launches a war, which is recounted in the Babylonian creation epic called the Enuma Elish, which in my reading of it is less a creation epic than a war epic, because most of the text talks about the first round of this cosmic war. As a result of this theft, the rest of the gods in the Sumerian pantheon go to war with Tiamat precisely in order to recover this stolen technology, whatever it was. The technology is recovered, but then we read that they're stolen again much later by another god by the name of Anzu, and again he wages a tremendous war. The war is fought in part to recover that technology, and when the war ends this time, it's interesting because the winning party in this war, led by a god named Ninurta, does an inventory of the stones that comprise these tablets of destinies. And I recount this text at great length in the Cosmic War.
Which is, folks, is absolutely worth getting the book. So do get it. If you get it any bookstore, and you can get it from our Amazon bookstore as well.
It's these texts, and I do want to say a little bit about the texts themselves. One of the things I am not doing, Whitley, is I am not making my own translations. In other words, I am not exposing myself to the same criticism that Zechariah Sitchin did when he made his own translation.
Right.
I am using accepted English translations by academic Sumerologists.
Which is one of the things that's so fascinating, because I began to think to myself as I was reading it, do these people have a kind of blind spot? Why don't they see what they're reading?
Well, I think, that's another excellent question, and it gets back to this whole idea of a war and a technology.
Right.
Because, let me kind of finish the answer to the other question, because it dovetails into this new question. there is an inventory taken at the end of this second cosmic war, so to speak, of this technology. And as a result of this inventory, some of the technology that was stolen and then recovered is carted off and used in other applications. This is very clear from the texts. Some of the technology is simply destroyed because it had no other use or purpose or function other than destruction, other than war. And then there is a peculiarly small category of things that were very clearly used for nothing but destructive purposes, but they could not be destroyed. And so they were carted off and secreted somewhere. You know, we don't know exactly where, but we can get into that question down the line because I think it's a rather important one. But now, as to why modern Assyriologists wouldn't be reading these texts in this way, I think there's two reasons, Whitley. I think, first of all, it's because they are just sort of habitually ingrained with the thought that these texts cannot be referring to anything other than mythology. They're nothing but metaphors. They are not historical in any sense.
In any way. But here's the odd thing. Wouldn't that mean that the human mind had changed profoundly since then?
Yeah, exactly.
We don't talk and think in metaphors now.
Yeah, exactly.
No one does.
Yeah, well, you know, I draw the analogy just to kind of bring that point home for the readers of the book, that, you know, we're dealing with a war that sort of occurs in two acts. It's almost like we're looking at an ancient Sumerian cosmic war version of World War I and World War II, because we have the same players. They're fighting over essentially the same things. But, you know, this inventory of this recovered technology, to me, is the most fascinating aspect of it all, because exactly the same thing occurs at the end of World War II. The Allies go in, they inventory all the technology of Nazi Germany, they decide which parts of it they want, which parts of it have to be destroyed, and they haul off a bunch of it. So again, you know, as you point out, human behavior and the human mind really hasn't changed all that much in the millennia since that war. So I think, again, we have to look at it very literally. And the other reason I think these academics really don't look at these texts is because they're really not looking for any science. And to me, you know, these texts are just full of references that are so very suggestively paralleled by recent developments in physics that it's absolutely astonishing to me that people can't see this.
Well, yeah, and you know, even in the simplest way, looking not at the extraordinary texts that are in your book, but at Ezekiel's wheel.
Right.
At this vision, if you try to think of something, anything, and folks, try this. Try to conceive of something that works on a principle that you don't know anything about.
Right.
At all.
Right.
And it's, you can say, well, I can conceive of a flying saucer, I can conceive of something that travels from place to place instantaneously, but you can't conceive of something that is completely outside of your experience at all.
Right.
But that's what's in Ezekiel.
Right.
Therefore, the conclusion is inescapable that it isn't metaphoric, that he saw this. He saw something.
Right.
Because otherwise he's the first, he invented the concept of the rocket thousands of years before there were such things. But this is even more true of these texts. You know, these texts look to me like almost like descriptions of scientific descriptions of technology, I should say, that are being written by people who no longer understand the technology.
Oh, absolutely.
But see it in its effects.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Whitley. And, you know, it's interesting that you mention this because this text where this inventory is taken, you know, I reproduce that text at great length in the Cosmic War because I want people to actually be able to sit down and read through it and read something that is called a myth by academicians. But yet you sit down and you read this, and it's like reading a dull bureaucratic report.
Right.
You know, it has none
None
of the feel of a mythology at all.
No.
And, you know, it's exactly as you say. It's as if people are trying to describe technological things that they no longer understand. It's like this text has been handed down to them, and they are simply copying it by rote. They're scribes. They're copying and passing it along without really understanding any of it. And I think it's very illuminating that we only can really begin to appreciate these texts in the last 50 or so years because of the developments of modern science. Who would have seriously considered 50 years or 60 years ago taking these Sumerian texts at their literal word when they clearly indicate that there was some sort of manipulation of human physical nature itself by outside sources? Who would have taken that seriously until the advent of genetics and more recently genetic engineering? Who similarly would take what these texts indicate about enormously destructive wars, about enormously sophisticated technologies, without the recent developments in physics? And that's my point. These academics that are translating these texts are so cut off, I think, in a certain sense, in their ivory towers from scientific developments, that they don't even have really the ability to see texts in that fashion.
Right, they don't, and yet it's just beneath the surface. And
Mm-hmm.
let me, if I could read one of these particular texts,
Sure.
if you don't have it at hand, unless there's one that particularly comes to mind, and you can you have it at hand.
No, go right ahead.
Okay. Now, here. And Enlil lifted his eyes, and he saw the child. The child was standing before the deity. The child's body was made of stone, of meteorite stone, which we know is nickel.
Mm-hmm.
So here the child is made of nickel. And why don't we, or some other stone? I mean, it could be, as you go on to discuss this, we do know that most meteors are made of nickel, so it's just a speculation. But nevertheless, what in the world is this child, and what deity? Obviously, this is not a metaphor. It is an attempt to describe something
right
in a language that doesn't have the concepts
right
to describe whatever is actually being seen.
Right. Well, this is my whole approach. It has been since I started all of this examination of what I call paleophysics in the Giza Death Star series. Because to me, when we look at these texts, one of the most fascinating things to me, Whitley, is the Enuma Elish itself, the Sumerian creation epic. Because the sequence of the destruction of Tiamat, which I believe was a title not only for a planet, but the ruler of a planet, and namely the planet that was exploded in our solar system. The sequence of the destruction of that planet that is described in the Enuma Elish is almost an exact sequence if you read it with scientific eyes. It's almost the exact type of sequence that you would get by using a weapon that is based on scalar or torsion physics that is able to manipulate the fabric of space and time itself. We have descriptions of enormous electrostatic displays, and this goes back to the idea of Mars's destruction by similar means. We have descriptions of enormous acoustic cavitations within the planet. In other words, just
within
gigantic
Mars.
Within Mars and within Tiamat.
Oh,
Just gigantic earthquakes. So in other words, these descriptions are all in line with the type of physics that, theoretically has the potential to be able to do this sort of stuff.
Now, were we participants, do you think, in this war, or were we simply little innocent creatures running around trying to hide behind the nearest stone?
I think, actually, that we're somewhere in between. I think that humanity was sort of caught in the middle of this conflict, because one of the things I point out in the Cosmic War, I reproduced some of Sir Lawrence Gardner's genealogical charts of
Yes.
the Sumerian pantheon, because I find them very fascinating from the standpoint of the dynamics, the political dynamics of what we see going on there. And one of the things I point out is that mankind himself is positioned in that whole pantheonic line of dynasties and so on, exactly between the two warring halves of this Sumerian pantheon. So in other words, we're looking at sort of a civil war.
Yes.
And
But aren't we also looking at something that was done to the human species that
Oh, yes,
did two
absolutely.
things that made us smaller and much shorter lived?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I believe this is absolutely true. Because one of the things that I point out in the book is that the now missing exploded planet, according to the exploded planet hypothesis of Dr. Tom Van Flandern.
And we'll get into that in just a moment. Go ahead.
Is this planet was probably around the mass of Saturn, but it was probably a solid planet.
A
So in other
stony
words,
planet, and out in the orbit where the Kuiper belt is now. Is that correct?
right. Well, actually, it's in the orbit of the asteroid belt.
I mean the asteroid belt,
Right.
excuse me, yes. The Kuiper belt being even farther out, being comets.
Right.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry.
And that, if we speculate for a moment that this planet had intelligent life, then it is likely that under the conditions of much greater gravity, that the physiology of whoever it was that may have lived on it would have been much larger. In other words,
Much larger, yes.
Yeah, they would have been giants.
And, bear in mind, folks, that what we're talking about now is a very distant time in which there would have been water on Mars, flowing water on Mars, and the solar system was in a very different state. The sun would have been much more energetic. And in addition, a rocky planet of that size might well have had extensive internal heating that would have enabled the planet itself to generate warmth. So it could be quite possibly something there that could sustain life. And the other possibility is, what if it wasn't really a viable planet, and life had not evolved there, but had come there from somewhere else?
Right. And I think that possibility has to be held out, too. Because, one of the other interesting things that I ran across in doing the research for the book was some of the thinking about pulsars of a physicist by the name of Dr. Paul Laviolette. And he points out that the distribution of pulsars in terms of the galaxy is non-random. In other words, there's no
That's
way...
right. It's quite an interesting theory.
Oh, yes, it's an extraordinarily interesting theory, because the distribution is not only non-random, but it is non-random in a way that can only be viewed from the Earth. So, in other words, whoever set out this elaborate galactic grid, and that's quite literally what it is, of distribution of pulsars, is doing so with the geometries in mind that one would see from the Earth. So in other words, the possibility exists that there's somebody way out there, I mean way, way out there, that knows exactly where we are. So, we can't exclude, I think, on the basis of the scientific evidence, that some of this may have come exactly from sources external to the solar system. This spins out in so many different ways that it's not even really funny. It's actually kind of creepy and scary.
Oh, well, yeah. That's extremely creepy and extremely scary. And let's go a little bit into some of the texts in order to sort of get deeper into this part of the conversation.
Right.
There is a remarkable argument between Enlil and Enki that you quote from. You imposed your loads on man, you bestowed noise on mankind. And, remember, folks, that does not sound very mythological to me.
No.
I mean, it's just a statement of fact by somebody who did not have another word to use besides loads or noise, because he was describing something that he did not understand anymore. You slaughtered a god together with his intelligence. Is that a reference to us?
Well, this is an extraordinarily important question, I think, because again, if we look at these texts, you're correct. Most of this second stage of this cosmic war, the stage I believe that involved the final destruction of Mars and so on, and the destruction of the exploded planet, I think that if we look at the text, the two gods in question, as you say, are Enlil and Enki. Now, Enki is, of the two, the more interesting character because he is, in the Babylonian mythology, he's kind of a sorcerer. He's a trickster. He's an imp. He specializes in all manner of divination and magic, in other words, science, if we read it that way. And it is Enki who is directly responsible for the creation of man. And if you read in the Sumerian text, it is also Enki, moreover, who intervenes to save mankind from the god's decision to wipe him out by means of a flood.
Yes, and yet Enlil says to Enki, you agreed to the wrong plan.
Right.
Have it reversed. I mean, it sounds like a reason, a casus belli.
Yes, exactly. In other words, to put what you're saying much more bluntly, and this is kind of the conclusion I came to in the Cosmic War, mankind himself is somehow, for some reason, being seen not only as the prize in this war, which would go back to your story about the creature from the cave. Mankind is not only the prize in this war, he's also the battlefield, so to speak, over which it is fought to some extent. So in other words, we're looking at something that involves huge political motivations that still remain rather obscure in the text, but we can conclude these two things. It was fought in part to recover technology that was stolen, and it was fought in part to somehow possess mankind and manipulate him.
And why? What would make us so important? And you make reference just in passing to Paul Violette's discovery that the pulsars are arranged around the whole cosmos,
right?
In a pattern that's relevant as non-random only in our particular area.
Right.
What is going on here?
Well, I think to go a little bit further than I do in the book. I think in part the answer lies in the biblical tradition. The whole idea of mankind being created in the image and likeness of God. In some versions of the fall of Lucifer that occur in Jewish tradition and then later are perpetuated in the Christian tradition, I think that in part there is just plain old jealousy involved because, the Sumerian texts make it very clear that a tremendous amount of the abilities of the gods were bestowed on mankind in order to allow mankind more or less to function for them as slave, as an intelligent slave. But if you read these Sumerian texts, Enki, as Enlil points out, you followed the wrong plan. I think what that means, speculating a bit here, is that Enki gave mankind too much, so to speak, in terms of intellectual ability. And that ultimately, and here's the real motivation, I think, for the war, that ultimately the power of these gods, or whoever they really were, was somehow threatened by that, because mankind in those texts appears to be reproducing much too quickly for their for their liking. And I think that this upset the apple cart in some way. It challenged their power. It challenged the authority that they assumed that they had over this region of the cosmos. And hence, this is another reason for the war. They literally wanted to, so to speak, clip mankind's wings and deny him the use of that technology. And, if there's one episode from all of these texts that stands out in my mind as confirming that reading, it's the Tower of Babel. Because what does the Tower of Babel episode actually say in the Old Testament? It says that if mankind is successful in completing this project. And it's very clear if you read the Old Testament with technological eyes that it has something to do with technology. But the phrase occurs that mankind will be able to do whatsoever he imagines it to do. So in other words, if you look at the Tower of Babel episode carefully, that whole thing, that whole project is brought to an absolute and utter end, not so much because God in the Old Testament wants to punish mankind, but because somehow what he is doing threatens the power structure.
And it would seem then that perhaps we were sort of experiment. And the experiment worked too well for somebody's comfort. And we have been left isolated here on this little planet in hopes that perhaps we'll just eventually become extinct.
Well, that is another profound reading of it, and I'd have to say on first hearing of it, I would have to agree with you. It looks that way. It has that feel. We've sort of been, to extend your metaphor somewhat, we've sort of been blockaded here. And it's very interesting, that whole idea itself, because you find it expressed in a similar fashion in some of the writings of the Christian apologist C.S. Lewis and other people that have become very popular in the past few decades. So again, the idea is there, and again, I think we have to seriously entertain some of these things.
Well, I know, I agree with you, but how, when you say seriously, what does any of this matter if the entire archaeological, paleontological, scientific communities are all just ignoring it? It's almost as if something has been done. And, this thought crossed my mind, and I'll bring it up now a little earlier in our conversation, and that was that what if something was done to the human mind to blind us? And perhaps what's happening now is, and the reason some of us are looking at things like this and saying, hey, wait a minute, what in the world are we doing? I mean, can't we see what happened here? It's perfectly clear. Is that the scales are falling from our eyes. In other words, with time, some people have begun to not anymore be blinded.
Right. I have to say that I think you're spot on here, because one of the things that is increasingly borne out to me in researching these books is that there just has to be some sort of suppressed science and some sort of suppressed history of humanity that only the cognoscenti are aware of, the powers that be have access to. And it really just kind of came home to me in doing the Cosmic War. I think this whole idea of an experiment and hidden knowledge is by now, to my mind, so satisfactorily and conclusively proven that the whole paradigm by which most people are blinded, the whole standard academic history of how we got here and so on and where we're supposed to be going, I think is just a huge, massive effort of deliberate misdirection. I really think, I think that the modern Russians are right. I think almost everything is up for grabs in terms of what we think we know, with probably the exception of geography and mathematics.
Yes. And, I know in Dreamland you discussed with William Henry this journey, this attack on the museum in Baghdad.
Oh, yes.
And all of the material that was taken from it. And it seems to me that there is someone who knows very well what's happening here and seeks to use those who are still blind against those of us who have opened our eyes and to prevent us from getting access to material that we would understand.
Oh, I have to agree totally with you. This is an excellent insight, and I am taking this what I call paleophysical view of ancient texts. In other words, that they actually do encode in a very sophisticated fashion some of the most abstruse and advanced ideas in modern science. The parallels oftentimes are just truly astonishing. But I think you're right. I think that there are people who know these things. In other words, they have been reading these texts in this way for a very, very long time. And you know, to get back to the work of Richard Hoagland for a moment, I think that this is another aspect that some of his work has borne out over the years, that somebody is reading these things in exactly the same way. And I think that in turn informs much of what some people have called the deep politics of our time, that the whole sudden interest in the Middle East, the whole peculiar action and activity of the Egyptian government building a wall around Giza, the whole sudden interest in projecting military power and force on the part of the West into that region. To me, there is something more in play here than just concerns over oil supply or terrorism or things of that sort. I think that there's a deeper agenda. I'm not discounting those other agendas, but, you know, again, if they are exercising a massive deception and pulling the wool over people's eyes who follow the standard paradigm, I think precisely it's because they know or have a similar take on these ancient texts and this ancient history. Because one of the things, Whitley, that emerges from that inventory of the stones that I referred to earlier is that those technologies that could not be destroyed and that were hidden, the texts themselves, esoteric tradition itself, seems to indicate that there are 3 to 4 possible places where that technology was taken. One of them would have been Egypt. The other, of course, would have been Mesopotamia. And then there are 2 very interesting possibilities, and that would be the Moon and Mars.
And you know what's happening, of course, with the Moon.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
I've been
China,
in regular daily contact with Mr. Hoagland, so
China,
I know very
the United
well.
States, India,
yes.
Russia,
right.
Japan are all in a race to get back to the moon.
In a mad race to get back there.
A mad race, exactly. Well, folks, you know, we are going to leave you here, and because we really have come to kind of full circle to the end of this ancient and extraordinary story as mankind wakes up on a number of different levels. Our level in which we begin to see and understand that ancient technologies were in use, another darker level that seeks to obscure the existence of those technologies, to hide them, and perhaps to use them in secret. And yet another level which understands them and perhaps wants to bring them back from the moon. What are these technologies? That is the question in my mind, because I'm not so sure. One of the things that must be involved are planet-capable destructive capacities. Another might be something to do with intelligence, that a field perhaps that if it is turned off or turned on will alter human intelligence all over the planet simultaneously. Could that be true? Well,
if I can interject on that.
I want you to answer it.
Oh.
More than interject, my friend. We're going to go on. I know this is supposed to be 45 minutes, but we're just going to go a couple more minutes if you don't mind.
Okay. You know, that really is one of the most profound observations, because in the Cosmic War, in one particular chapter, I came to the conclusion that part of this technology involved precisely, as you said, the ability to create some sort of field that had the ability to impress certain emotional states on people. And it's very interesting to me because that sort of effect is written about in the physics literature as being one possible byproduct of the ability to manipulate scalar or torsion fields.
Yes.
So, you know, to me, Whitley, it's very probable that some of that technology that could not be destroyed was secreted, and very possibly on the moon. And in that connection, I think it's interesting to note that Mr. Hoagland, in his recent book, has pointed out that is one of the possible technologies that might be there. So, this whole idea of consciousness manipulation, I think, is an inevitable consequence of some of this type of physics. It not only has, as you mentioned, planetary destruction capabilities, but I think it has a profound and ultimately very deleterious ability to manipulate and influence human consciousness.
And we have a situation where so many different governments on this planet, and I don't mean just the United States government,
right,
which is afflicted by this too, are obsessed with control.
Oh, yes.
Beyond the limits of reason.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Even the British, if you go to England, you discover quite soon that country is just absolute. Every single inch of it is under video surveillance all the time.
Yeah.
Incredible. And you have countries like India, China, even more, Pakistan, Syria, on and on, where there is Russia, where there is so much surveillance, so much watching, and so little trust for their own people that it is really makes you think that these governments don't serve their people, that they serve another master, and if the people understood who that was, they would not let it stand.
Oh, yes, I quite agree. I totally agree with you. I think we're seeing, in a way, the modern lineaments of that ancient conflict between Enlil and Enki all over again. Because, Enlil represents, so to speak, that god of control,
right,
of order.
Yes.
And Enki represents that god who's more interested, so to speak, in letting people have their way and letting them be who they are and think the things they want to do. And, to me, again, the mythological perspective on the deep politics of modern times is just absolutely stunning.
Well, thank you, Joseph. We have come to beyond the end of our conversation together. Joseph's book, The Cosmic War, Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Physics and Ancient Texts. Boy, if you want an enjoyable experience and a mind-opening experience, do pick this up. This is really worth having. It is a treasure trove of information, and as Joseph always, we so enjoy you having you as part of Dreamland and on this program. It's always it makes for an exciting show. All I have to say in conclusion is go Enki.
Yeah, and Whitley, thank you for having me back on, and Merry Christmas to you and Ann and to all your Dreamland listeners.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Linda Moulton Howe is with us from earthfiles.com, the world's leading website of its kind. You cannot know what is happening on the edge without reading earthfiles.com every day. There's a reason that Linda Moulton Howe won an Emmy. It's because she's that good. Today we're going to go back to Texas briefly to find out exactly what she can tell us about what's going on, and she's already said to me there is much more that she cannot yet tell us but will as soon as possible. It ain't over. There is something incredible happening there, and somebody's trying very hard and very clumsily to cover it up. Then she's going to be talking about something truly incredible involving our universe. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Boy, are you right in terms of somebody trying to cover up what has been happening in Texas. On January 23rd, 2008, the Fort Worth Air Force Reserve Command Public Affairs released what they called a public awareness news release. And this is a quote, that they had, quote, realized an error was made regarding the reported training activity of military aircraft. 10 F-16s from the 457th Fighter Squadron were performing training operations from 6 to 8 p.m. Tuesday, January 8th, 2008, in the Brownwood Military Operating Area, which includes the airspace above Erath County. And Erath County is where Dublin, Stephenville, and Selden are. That more than 36 people, by the count of the local newspapers and media, have reported since January 1 up to the most recent January 15th of multiple strange and large light configurations in the skies over those towns southwest of Fort Worth, Texas. And the extraordinary sunset sighting by Ricky Sorrells that I reported on Dreamland last week, down in his wood where he went to do deer hunting, and above him was what looked to him like matte finished metal, the color of barn tin, with embedded cone-shaped holes all throughout as far as he could see. And after I had done the interview, he went back out to his maple trees and walked off the furthest that he could see, left and right, and said it was at least 3 football field lengths, but he never saw the edges. So all we can say is an object 300 feet above Ricky Sorrell at sunset that was at least 1,000 feet long. Now, another very interesting part of this strange and phony effort on the part of the military to now explain away 2 weeks of multiple eyewitness sightings is back to this Major Carl Lewis. Major Carl Lewis was first quoted in an Associated Press release on January 15th that went to national newspapers in which it said, and this was by Angela Brown, local reporter from the Stephenville newspaper, Major Carl Lewis, a spokesman for the 301st Fighter Wing at the Joint Reserve Base Naval Air Station in Fort Worth, said no F-16s or other aircraft from his base were in the area the night of January 8th when most people reported the sighting. Well, that night of January 8th, there were multiple eyewitness sightings of these mixed bags of colored lights, rectangular lights that may have been in a configuration a mile long and a half mile wide. But that is not the end of the story. And it is this same Major Carl Lewis who is putting out this quote-unquote erroneous remembering of what actually happened from his military point of view on January 8th, and he dismissed their first denial as, quote, an internal communications error, unquote. But even the Dallas Morning News did not buy this. They said in their own newspaper article yesterday on January 23rd, quote, this still leaves unanswered the question of what F-16s might have been doing on January 8th that would look like a line of silent glowing spheres, unquote. Right now, as we go into the upcoming week of what will be the last week of January and beginning of February, I just want our Dreamland listeners to know there has been non-public military intimidation of eyewitnesses, and there are now people who are coming forth with some of the most remarkable videotape that I think that I have ever heard anybody to have. And we're talking about spheres, orbs, and beams of light. When I can, I will report more on Dreamland and at Earth Files. But today, I think I have a mental treat beyond all this phenomena in Texas. While the farmers there and the residents in this farming community are beginning to wonder about other realities and dimensions in their own backyard, a professor in Auckland, New Zealand, published a paper in December that seriously raises the question, could we be in a virtual reality world and universe? He is Brian Whitworth, Ph.D. in Information Systems and now Senior Lecturer at the Institute for Information and Mathematical Sciences at Massey University in Auckland. In his paper, he quotes from a 2005 book entitled The World's 20 Greatest Unsolved Problems. And here is a quote. Quantum physicists who work with quantum theory every day don't really know quite what to make of it. They fill blackboards with quantum calculations and acknowledge that it is probably the most powerful, accurate, and predictive scientific theory ever developed. But the very suggestion that it might be literally true as a description of nature is still greeted with cynicism, incomprehension, and even anger, unquote. Professor Whitworth's goal is to provide another model in which cosmologists might look at our universe that is not hamstrung by the paradoxes in trying to make sense of a physically objective universe in which all of the underlying processing creating this universe is defined by quantum mechanics, in which not even an atom can be directly measured in time and space, because quantum mechanics says it is in all places at once. Professor Whitworth has worked for decades in mathematics and information systems and finds many analogies in the computer world to how quantum mechanics says this universe actually works. I talked with him this week and began by asking him what the reaction has been from his academic colleagues.
The most common comment which one could expect would be that you can't prove it. But if you think about it, suppose everybody thought the world was a virtual reality. They were brought up from childhood to believe this. And you one day had the idea that it was an objective reality, that it wasn't created by processing, that it was actually just there and existed. And I said to you, well, okay, if you believe that, why don't you prove it? I think you'd have a bit of trouble proving it, okay? I mean, you could say, well, I know the world's objective because I experience it. And people would reply, but you only experience your input. Or you might say, well, look, I have lots of mathematical laws that can predict things. And they say, well, of course you do, because it's all based on mathematics. And then you say, well, look, the universe is enormous. It's huge. How can it possibly be a virtual reality to be so big? And then they would say, well, it's only big to you. You know, I mean, it's only big to people inside it. And the same thing, it's been going for billions of years. You might say, well, that might be just a few seconds of processing. Nobody really knows. And so on. You'd actually find it quite difficult to prove your case. So I guess the point is that people assume that objective reality is provable. It's a proven theory, but it's not. It's an axiom, and it's just as unproven as virtual reality theory. So from a scientific perspective, neither objective reality nor virtual reality are proven. And what's happening is that modern physics, with things like time dilation and space contraction, teleportation, multi-existence and so on, seem actually more supportive of a virtual reality universe than an objective reality one.
And the strongest piece that supports the virtual reality from your point of view is?
Well, there's a whole lot of them there. For example, as objects go faster and faster, their mass increases. They get heavier and heavier. And as they approach the speed of light, their mass increases to infinity, in theory. So how come? How come? If the world's physically objective, how can mass just get bigger and bigger and bigger just because a thing goes faster and faster?
And how does virtual reality answer that question?
Well, it's to do with the processing allocation. There's a fixed amount of processing available, let's say in space. If an object is being passed from point to point in space, there's only a certain amount of processing available at each point in space, okay? And if that processing is being involved in the calculation of movement, that changes the processing. The smaller and smaller amount that's left makes the mass seem greater and greater.
Meaning that the processing ability is being used up?
Being used up in the movement, yeah. And that leaves a smaller and smaller amount left over to do the mass, which then changes the mass. In other words, it takes longer to do what it has to do. So the idea is that it's a network, that space is a network, and each is like a little mini processor.
But they have to be coordinated by some big processor with a capital P?
Well, that's one of the questions, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is where you get to the speed of light, right? Can you explain that in a virtual reality universe, why there is a speed of light?
Yeah, it's just like a screen. So your screen has a certain rate that it refreshes, which depends on the little points that make up the screen. And each of these points can only flash on and off at a certain rate. So when a pixel moves across the screen, what it means is it starts off with 1 point flashes, then that point turns off, and then the next point flashes, and so on. So the rate of movement depends on the rate of flashing of your screen. It's refresh rate. That's going to mean that a dot can move across your screen so fast and no faster.
And that would be the speed of light in this universe.
That would be the speed of light that we see, yes.
It would explain the question about why should there be a maximum speed such as the speed of light.
Yes, it explains that question by answering that in space, each point of space has a fixed amount of processing, a finite allocation. So things that are moving from point to point in space can only be processed at a certain rate. The speed of light then is the refresh rate of space.
What then is the Big Bang?
The Big Bang is when the simulation was started, when the processing began.
When the computer is turned on, right?
Well, we don't know that it's a computer. We only know that it's processing. the theory doesn't postulate any hardware or any machines running anything in another world. But a lot of people have trouble with the idea that time began at the Big Bang, and I certainly did, and that space began. How can time begin? Surely something must have caused time to begin, but how can anything cause anything if there's no time to have prior event? But if you say that we're in a virtual reality or a local reality, then the Big Bang is when our time began, and it's when our space began. And that's perfectly reasonable. So if you go online to Second Life or something, when you switch on your computer and enter the reality, that's when its time began.
And that, a singularity, a Big Bang, would be the equivalent of turning on the computer.
Correct. And the digital has to start at a particular point and a particular time. And that time is when your operating system, let's say it's Windows or it could be a Mac, at that time the clock of that session is started up.
In these analogies between the computer world, virtual reality, and this universe we're trying to understand, how would your axiom or hypothesis explain why this virtual reality universe would seem now to be expanding at an exponential rate into some infinity?
Well, that's one of the questions I'm thinking about. So if anyone has any ideas, let me know. But I guess the alternative would be that it starts at a particular size and a particular dimension, in which case you'd have to decide how big it was going to be, wouldn't you? If you're playing a game or whatever in a virtual world on a computer, are you the pixels?
When you ask that question, I'm watching the computer screen that I'm in front of.
And there's pixels there.
And they are definitely pixels, but from my point of view, I am outside of the screen and the computer controlling what's happening, at least in terms of selecting the programs I'm using and how I'm going to edit. And therefore, I would say that I, the intelligence outside of my computer screen, I am not the pixels that I'm watching.
No, and your avatar is like the little mouse arrow on the screen, correct? That's what acts for you.
Mm-hmm.
That's your little hand, or that's sort of like your body.
Right.
Now, the physical world as a virtual reality doesn't necessarily imply that our consciousness is in the virtual reality. It could be exactly the same as you playing an avatar in a game. It's conceivable that while everything you see and hear is definitely part of the pixels, certainly part of the virtual reality, it's possible that you're looking from the virtual reality. This relates to very, very deep questions about whether a mechanical universe could create consciousness and so on. I must admit I haven't really worked through all these things yet, but it's certainly something that's concerned a lot of people from Descartes on.
All of this keeps leading to the question of, let's call it consciousness with a capital C or intelligence with a capital I, that would be responsible for creating the virtual reality universe.
You want to step out of this world and see what's going on elsewhere, and that's not really possible. But the second question is whether the interface, whether the pixels are everything that there is, and that is a different question.
But the pixels would not be the prime intelligence or consciousness that created the pixels.
The postulate is that the physical universe, if it is indeed a virtual reality, cannot create itself out of itself. It's just not possible. So there must be something outside of it, and therefore quantum mechanics is actually describing this something. The equations of quantum mechanics, which are quite different from our concepts of physical reality, are describing this something, and the idea is that what we're seeing as we walk around is in fact just an interface, which is calculated at the moment when we look, a sort of an on-demand thing. We're just working from analogies here. Now, if we confer to some person playing a computer game and they're sitting there running around in a forest on the screen and gathering things and fighting monsters and exploring things, then their body would correspond to the avatar, the pixels that are running around. But in that particular case, we can see that they themselves are not actually in the interface. They may get completely identified with the interface. They may get to such a point where they don't hear anybody around them talking to them, and all they can see is the interface. Now, whether this is true in our case, I don't know. That's a question.
In a way, your hypothesis on this being a virtual reality universe would imply a proof of intelligence and consciousness on the outside that could create the virtual reality universe, which many people then would say that is God or Allah or whatever the words are for the force behind all life.
I know if I was creating the universe, I wouldn't leave that as an option. I'd leave them guessing. So.
Which is exactly where everybody is.
Yeah, and I don't think we need to know everything. The number one thing we're looking at this point is whether this theory is useful. Physics is really in a bind at the moment. It's got a whole lot of problems that are created by quantum mechanics. Objective realism just is facing these paradoxes that it probably will never, ever solve. And string theory was supposed to come running to the rescue, but string theory seems bogged down at the moment in a mire of complexity. There's more versions of string theory than there are atoms in the world or the universe or something like that. So physics is in a bind. And what I'm suggesting is that this particular approach might be useful because it frees up the options for people to think about different types of processing and how it might work. The problem is a lot of people bring very fixed ideas to this. You know, they have their idea of God, or they're thinking there's a computer in the sky, or they're thinking that there's a matrix and we're all being harvested, or that the world is a dream, and so on.
But you can't have intelligence and thought and be discussing what we're discussing and not immediately go in your mind to the question, what would be the intelligence that would create the virtual reality universe? It's like two sides of a coin. If you have a virtual reality universe, something had to make it.
Something had to make it. Some processing in this case, not just something. Some processing has to make it, yes. But that doesn't mean it's a man with a beard in the sky, or it doesn't even mean that it's one God. It could be many gods. This whole thing could be some kid playing on their computer in their room at night when Dad's not looking.
What you mean is that there could be just so many parallels of dimensions of realities in which we could be the screen in the room of a child in another computer could be another universe or another dimension.
Well, we don't know. That's the point. One of the people who commented online said, well, if I'm in a virtual reality, then the graphics are great, but the plot sucks. That was their comment. So, again, I wouldn't argue with that.
Everybody wants to know who's responsible for the plots that suck.
We all want to know everything, want to know what's running it, but maybe that's not the deal. Maybe that's just not how it works.
And one final thought. It's only been in the last 6 weeks that I have heard from a man in the human abduction syndrome who described for me, not knowing anything about this. In fact, I talked with him before I had ever seen this virtual reality paper by Professor Whitworth. The abductee said that he had been on a craft and the people with him were the blonde, and that they took him into a room and they showed him suspended in a kind of strange light, but appeared to be dark and sparkly material. And telepathically, the blonde beings communicated to this abductee that was really our universe, that they had been experimenting with singularities that they didn't understand. And it went out of their control, and now the universe that we are in is out of their control, and they don't know what to do about it.
Which would mean they have a big problem, considering that our universe is not exactly small. But you know something fascinating, Linda? A couple of things. First, there is evidence that's been reported by a group of cosmologists just recently that a 9 billion light-year wide gap in our universe indicates that there is another universe just like it beyond that gap, and the light from which either has not or cannot reach our universe, not to mention the fact that yet another group has recently determined mathematically that parallel universes must be physically real.
Right.
So whatever is going on, it is terribly, terribly complex. But then again, you look inside a human brain, just one ordinary person's brain, and what you see there immediately is almost unimaginable complexity.
Right. And I'm also reminded all the way back to 1983, hearing from somebody who had worked in military intelligence in our government, talking about the non-human presence as being real and known to him and others, even though there was that policy of denial in the interest of national security. And he said that one of the Ebens had communicated to its keeper at Los Alamos all the way back to the period of 1949 to 1952, this sentence: if you only knew what the cosmos looked like, you would compare it to a beach of sand in which every grain was a universe.
I can well believe that. That's essentially what the Master of the Keys said to me, that there were many universes beyond where we are. And folks, we're talking not about galaxies like the Milky Way galaxy and the Andromeda galaxy. We're talking, when we say universes, about collections of billions and billions of those galaxies. Does anybody remember Carl Sagan, billions and billions?
What you mean is this universe is estimated to be 13.7 billion light years in diameter. And if there are as many as the number of grains of sand on a beach, we're talking about almost an infinite number of universi. And in this paper that Professor Whitworth has now done, which is so mind-stretching, you cannot help but wonder, if there were this infinite number of universi, is it because everything is equivalent to somebody's computer processing on a scale that, from their point of view, is like the screen that I have in front of me right now talking to you?
Linda, it's an awesome and kind of a scary thought, because, you know, if we are part of something that is sort of fundamentally out of control, and it certainly feels like that, then and one thing is true of our universe: anything could happen. Linda, it's been great having you. It was not a crater, but something had penetrated it, blown up inside, and caused the entire pyramid to collapse. And understand that this thing is many, many times the size of the Giza pyramid, and so whatever it was happening on an absolutely gigantic scale. Joseph Farrell, I'm so excited to talk about the possibility of cosmic war in the distant past. His book, The Cosmic War, Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Physics, and Ancient Texts. Welcome, Joseph.
Well, thank you for having me back, Whitley. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, you've been with us any number of times, and for good reason. I don't think I know of anyone who knows more about things like the Nazi UFO connection and all kinds of really fascinating stuff. In fact, if you could talk about the Nazi UFO connection for a few minutes, I would be very glad.
Well, sure. One of the things that I've come across, and actually I have a new book at the publisher right now that kind of pursues the story a little bit further. The Bell Project, which many of your listeners will remember from previous shows, I believe, was in part a project to master the manipulation of scalar or torsion fields, whatever you wish to call them, and to do so in part for propulsion purposes, in part for the purposes of accessing what we would call free energy or zero-point energy.
Now, remind us about the Bell Project, but some of us may not remember.
Okay, the Bell was Nazi Germany's most highly classified research project during the Second World War. It was classified higher than their atomic bomb project, which I also believe was much more successful than we've been led to believe. They classified it as Kriegsentscheidend, which is a German word that means war decisive or decisive for the war. So in other words, this was at the very, very pinnacle of all of their tremendously exotic secret weapons projects. And the Bell itself was this device that stood approximately 15 to 18 feet tall, about 12 to 15 feet wide. It looked like a bell, and hence that's how it got the nickname. But it was a project that was housed in Lower Silesia, which is that little finger of Germany that used to stick down between Poland and Czechoslovakia. It was housed underground. It was tested as an offshoot of some of the thinking of Swedish physicist Hannes Alfvén. This physics looks at some of the planetary geological features, such as the Hyginus Rill on the Moon, and more importantly, the Valle Marineris on Mars, which is, as you know, this extraordinarily huge, almost Grand Canyon-like feature that literally stretches across the entire equator of one entire hemisphere of the planet.
Well, I believe it's actually bigger than the Grand Canyon.
Oh, yes, much, much bigger. I mean, I'm just trying to give the listeners a picture in their mind that they can compare this to, but it's much, much deeper by several miles and much wider by several tens, if not hundreds of miles in some places. But this literally stretches across, almost in a straight line, an entire hemisphere of the Martian surface. And one of the interesting things that one of these plasma physicists has pointed out is that this feature on Mars has every appearance of having been literally scoured out by a tremendously huge plasma electrostatic discharge. Now, I find it extraordinarily interesting because if we go back to ancient Egyptian, Hurrian, and Sumerian texts, they refer oftentimes to the scarred warrior. And, you know, Mars's association with war in the human culture and astrology and esoteric tradition dates back literally millennia. So I think what we're looking at here is precisely as you say. We're looking at a war that specifically evolved, Earth and Mars, and it resulted in the literal physical murder or destruction of that planet's environment. And I think, you know, the story that you mentioned also indicates a spiritual connection or problem with humanity that has stemmed from that time. And again, I don't have any argument with that idea because this really is the only conclusion that I can come to after having examined some of the texts that I examined in the Cosmic War. There was a spiritual consequence to this war. I think it's been with us ever since.
A spiritual consequence in what sense?
Well, I think that in part, you know, if we look at some of the Sumerian texts, I think that...
Welcome to Dreamland's Whitley Strieber. Later in the show, Linda Moulton Howe's got a hot update from Texas. The military is now backtracking and saying they did have jets in the air, and it was their jets that everyone saw. Not even the Dallas Morning News is buying that. The media and the American public are sick of the cover-up, and it's becoming very, very obvious that it's over. And did you see, by the way, that incredible image from Mars of the apparent figure that the scientists are saying is a trick of light? Well, I'm sorry. It's either a figure or a statue. Tricks of light don't have arms and dark images around the waist. I mean, how stupid do they think we are? How do you explain it, though? Well, that's another question. It might have something to do with today's guest, Joseph Farrell. We're going to be talking about cosmic war. Are we the remnant of a greater civilization? This is a question that is a burning question in my mind for a particular reason, and that is that many, many years ago, when I first was involved with the Mars Face, when I sat in an apartment in New York City in 1985, in October of 1985, with Dick Hoagland, looking over the old Viking photographs and looking at that face staring up from below, I joined a group of scientists who were then on a message system. This was pre-internet, that where we were discussing what had happened on Mars. And this was long before all of the lying and the confusion and the NASA nonsense, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the changes in the Martian surface that have come to obscure those forms that were so clear in the Viking photographs. Now, one of the things I will never forget is one of those messages came up and it said, Mars was murdered. And the message referred to the D&H pyramid and that crater in the lower edge of it, and said that this particular scientist said, who became quite a famous scientist, I won't mention his name because I think that he'd probably be ruined in the planetological community now if anyone knew that he had ever said this. In any case, he said that that pyramid that had been entered by something that had come from the side, not from above. In other words,
extraordinarily high voltages with some rather exotic materials in it. And according to the concentration camp victims and so on who actually were forced to work in this project during the war, they saw this thing floating at nighttime, in some cases above the tree lines at night in glowing kind of a pale blue glow. So what I believe the bell to be is probably the actual historical basis for many of the Nazi UFO accounts and legends that we've been hearing since the end of the Second World War. Now, one more thing about it that I think is kind of fascinating that ties, interestingly enough, into Richard Hoagland's most recent book, Dark Mission, is that at the end of the Second World War, the Bell Project went completely missing, along with the SS general who had control of the project and all of its project documentation. And there really are only two tracks that can be ascertained from the historical record as to where it might have gone. One of them is that it disappeared into some independent post-war Nazi research project in Latin America. And the other, of course, would be that it entered the labyrinthine paperclip elements that we brought into this country after the war and disappeared into some very super secret American anti-gravity project. So it's a fascinating story, and the reason I mention Richard Hoagland is that, of course, in his new book, Dark Mission, he has come to the conclusion that not only was there a secret NASA space program, but that it probably had access to some of these technologies or similar technologies, and moreover, that these elements, consisting in part of Nazis and secret society connections and so on, had something to do with the Kennedy assassination, which is more or less the conclusion that I came to in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell. So it's a really fascinating topic, and it dovetails and spins out in any number of directions.
You know, when shortly after I published Communion, I received a letter from a woman who had been walking in the woods with her son. And she said that a little man in a blue uniform, a tiny figure, had come out of a cave in these woods and said to her that he was a rebel and that the people of Earth had lost a war many thousands of years ago, that this war had involved great destruction in our solar system, and that the war had been between Earth and Mars, and that Mars had lost its ability to support life, but the Martians had not lost the war, that they had, in fact, captured our souls, and they kept us in a state of perpetual reincarnation. And in their language, the word for our planet was dead forever. We would continue to reincarnate into the physical forever. And he said he felt this was wrong and that we should be released. How do you react to that?
Well, it's a very intriguing story, and in fact, the whole idea of a war between Earth and Mars is kind of the conclusion that I've come to in the cosmic war. I posit in the book the existence of a civilization based on some of the texts that I examine, that this civilization was interplanetary in nature, that it consisted at the minimum of a civilization which existed here on Earth, on our local celestial neighbor, the Moon, most definitely on Mars, and probably had outposts or colonies, as it were, on some of the satellites of Jupiter and Saturn. So it was a rather extensive thing. And in saying that, I want to kind of reinforce your opening remarks about Mars and the D&M pyramid and Mars having been murdered. because in my own researches, this is what I've come across. Graham Hancock has said something very similar. Richard Hoagland, of course, in his book, The Monuments of Mars, talks very specifically about the damage to the D&M pyramid. And the scientist that he consulted said that the damage has every appearance of being similar to the type of deep scouring penetration that one would expect from a very, very high energy particle beam. Now, I find that extraordinarily intriguing, Whitley, especially in connection with this story about a war between Earth and Mars, because in my research in the cosmic war, one of the things that I point out is that the modern plasma cosmology physics that has been developed